Okay.
Okay, are you ready? Our speaker today is our good friend and Mr. Sister, Steve Terrell. And Steve's a retired attorney who was named to the Indiana State Bar Association's General Practice Hall of Fame in 2007, and he won the Indiana Lawyers Barrister Award in 2014. He's been writing for a long time, and he won the Midwest Writers Manny Award in 2011. And since then, he's written and published 3 novels, which include The Last Train to Stratton, Stars Fall, and The First Rule. He's also written dozens of short stories, many of them appearing in the Speed City Sisters anthologies, and another story titled In Deepest Darkness, which was selected by Lee Child, of all people, for the Best Mystery Series Honor Roll of 2021. So his latest book, The Madness of John Terrell, is officially coming out next week. Is that right? Tuesday. And as you may know, it's nonfiction, and it's all about his great uncle who committed one of Indiana's most sensational murders back in 1903. And today he's going to tell us about that, as well as how he discovered this family secret and how he researched it and got it into print. So now I will stop talking and turn things over to our good friend and prolific writer, Steve Terrell.
Okay, let's see if I can get this right now. We'll click on that, go up here, see if I can do this. Play from current side. This interview, okay. Okay, what's it look like? Ah, good, good, great. Okay. Well, let me just turn this off on. Okay. The Madness of John Terrell. Revenge and Insanity on Trial in the Heartland. This is a book of a passion with me, I think is the best way to describe it. And let's move forward. One of my favorite quotes, I'm trying to get something off my screen here. I don't know if it, okay. Okay, this is one of my favorite quotes ever. And I think it applies to this story, which isn't about murder at all. It's Kate Atkinson, who's a wonderful writer, Human Croquet. And as you can see, it says, the beginning is the word, and the end is silence, and in between are all the stories. And I think that applies to a lot of what all of us write. Melvin Wolfe was a mean, nasty, cheating son of a bitch, and the handsomest man I ever saw. Right up to the day my pa put a shotgun against his head and blew his brains all over Doc Saunders' office. Blew him straight to hell. Blew the rest of our lives to hell, too. That's the beginning of the story, The Madness of John Terrell. It's a story of 3 people. There's John, my great uncle, who was a farmer and a rich oil man, a businessman, an atheist, and a father. His 19-year-old daughter, Lucy, who was a scorned woman, an abused wife, a mother, and a daughter. And Melvin Wolfe, Leo Melvin Wolfe, the cat of Wells County. He was a father, an estranged husband, and a victim. For those of you, and there are some of you who saw my presentation at the Indiana State Library, relax. This is a little different presentation. It's a little different program. We're going to talk a little bit more about my research and the writing process and the getting published process, as opposed to just telling the complete story of John Terrell that's in the book. Well, let's start off with part one, discovering the story. So the pandemic, how many of you remember the pandemic? Hands up. Okay. So what do? You're stuck at home. And I had, on top of that, I had recently closed my law office and I was retired. I just was getting used to being retired. So I decided I'd work on my family tree. I've done that before. I'd done some of it, but I had some time to really concentrate and decided to do some research on my family tree. Now, these are two slides out of my family tree. And if you look, the folks here can't hear me when I walk away, probably. If you look on the left side, lower right-hand corner of the left slide, you will see my name. That's me. If you follow it up, those are my siblings and in-laws next to me. If you follow that up, you will see my mother and father. Thomas Terrell is the one in blue. And one above that, you will see William Ulysses Grant Terrell, my grandfather, and his wife. And above that, to the far left, is William Wesley Terrell, my great-grandfather. Also, by the way, a preacher. I mentioned before, I think. But anyway, he was a preacher. If you move to the right, the top line, you'll see William Terrell again. That's the same guy, because he was married before to Rebecca Thornburg. You will see his second marriage was to Mary Thornburg. Mary Thornburg was my great-grandmother. Rebecca Thornburg was her first cousin. She was my great-grandfather's first wife, and I didn't know anything about that. So when I'm doing the research, I found out he was married before. Rebecca, they were married a short time, and Rebecca died shortly after their first son, their second child, was born. Their son is the one in blue here, John Wesley Terrell. John is the John of the Madness of John Terrell. And if you look underneath that, the third line down to the far left, you'll see Mary L. Terrell. That's Lucy. Her name was Mary Lucy Terrell, but nobody ever called her Mary. It was always Lucy throughout her life. And next to her is Leo Wolf, who is the victim we just talked about. So I find this out. I'd never heard of John Wesley Terrell, as I was doing my research. And so I found him, I found his birth date, and I found his death date. And if any of you have ever done family and genealogy, you probably know that a great resource for information are death notices. So you can find out all sorts of stuff in a death notice that isn't in the public record. So I did a search on newspapers.com, great resource, for John Wesley Terrell and the date of his death, and searched Central Indiana newspapers. And what I found, the first story, and this is not an exaggeration, the first story I find is this, and my jaw hit my desk. John W. Terrell succumbs here. Wells County man who murdered son-in-law dies at home of daughter. Crime occurred in 1903. Deceased taken at L. If you go through and read this, it just says his death brings an end to the most noted criminal case in Wells County and the state of Indiana, in which John Terrell in 1903 shot and killed his son-in-law, Melvin Wolf. And so suddenly it was like, well, I was asked yesterday in an interview with the Indiana lawyer about this book, and she said, well, what was your reaction? I said, well, to be honest, it was, holy shit. So that obviously, if you find that, you have something to research. I didn't quite know right then that I had a book, but I knew there was more to learn about this. So the research that what maybe I thought was going to be a couple of weeks of looking up some newspaper articles turned into 3+ years of research for this book. And here are some of the places I looked. The Indiana Archives, which was essential because that's where I found the transcript of the trial. The Indiana State Library, Wells County Public Library, where I'm going to be speaking on Tuesday, the day of the release, was very helpful. Bracken Library at Ball State, looking up background history of the oil boom in Indiana. Randolph and Wells County Historical Societies, particularly the Randolph County one, giving me some background. Randolph County Clerk, the auditor, the recorder, being a lawyer and knowing how to research legal records was very helpful in this. Histories. They're old history books. They're huge, about the turn of the century. I don't know who financed them, but there was a company out of Chicago that published these massive volumes of history of different counties in Indiana. And there was one of Randolph County, published in, I think, 1882. There's one of Wells County and Adams County that was published as a joint volume. And that was sometime, I think, about 1902 when it was published. But these volumes are huge, and they have a lot of little details about the people who lived in the counties. It's a wonderful resource if you're doing family research or if you're writing a story set in that time frame. And of course, online resources, ancestry.com, newspapers.com, etc. And also the cemeteries, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But cemeteries are fascinating to just give you a feel for, at least with me, to give me a feel for the people whose lives you're talking about. Okay, newspapers, newspapers.com, newspaperarchive.com, not as widely known, doesn't have as many, but was useful. Also, there were some issues that I could not find online, and I got from the Wells County Public Library that they had copies of. My research, very quickly, I found hundreds of stories about this, and the headlines were great. This is the time of the yellow press. Horrible way of revenge, slain while surgeon was using a knife. Notice the German one. That's from an Indianapolis German newspaper, German language newspaper. Terrell murder expresses no sorrow for the deed. This one, blew off head of son-in-law. Yeah, they weren't shy about their headlines. Interestingly, it was on surgeon's table. Wounded victim shot in the leg before amputation was in progress. They didn't always stay with the facts. Well, he may have required an amputation of that leg. The surgeon was not standing over him with a knife, as I found out with the trial transcript. The surgeon, excuse me, there was a back door to the doctor's office surgery room. And the doctor and the other guy in that room, as John was approaching, found a use for that back door. And they took off running different directions. So, also, it ended up on the front page of the New York Times the day after that happened. An interesting point, or a point you may want to take a look at. Over here, I have the paper research that I have. Now, I have a lot more research than is over there. A lot of it's on my computer that I didn't print off. But if you want to take the time and take a look, there's a volume with newspapers, articles. There's 2 volumes with my notes and with pages from the transcript. That is not the entire transcript. And there are other pages, 2 other volumes, I'm sorry, over there with my some research issue, background research. And there is also another folder over there that has a volume called The Murder Trial of John Terrell. And I found that in the Wells County Library. It has, excuse me, I'm going to put a throat lozenge in. I'm having a little difficulty here. That was a collection of the newspaper articles by one of the local newspapers in Bluffton. And they put it together in a little cheap book after the trial was over and sold it. And I have not found an original, but the Wells County Library actually had a photocopy of that book. And that's where I found it. The newspapers were great because even though it was 1903, they even had pictures of the crime scene. This on the left is a picture of what is now Indiana Highway 1, just south of the little town of Petroleum. And that is where the shooting took place. That's where John shot Melvin on the roadside. That was where he first ambushed him. And the second one shows the actual doctor's room where John broke into it. Melvin's head was lying down at the left side. And if you look up above, you'll see 2 black rectangles. That's where John knocked out 2 boards. The door was locked. He used the barrel of his shotgun to knock in 2 boards and then stuck his shotgun through there and blew Melvin's brains all over the doctor's office. 1903. I also found, which I didn't know anything about, the story of the Grand Opera House, which John was building. He was the principal investor in this, and it was being built in downtown Bluffton. It is no longer there. It was torn down, turned into a movie theater, and then eventually torn down in the late 1970s after a fire. But John was in his jail cell waiting trial, and his cell overlooked the construction site. And he was, in the afternoon, he'd spend his afternoon leaning out his jail cell and yelling instructions to the workmen who were building the Grand Opera House. Even more, and more interesting for me, what was fascinating is the fact that in October of 1903, it was time to lay the cornerstone. So the sheriff let John out of jail to go across the street to lay the cornerstone. It was a big ceremony, several hundred people there. And John came out and got to lay the cornerstone for the Bluffton Grand Opera House. There were, you may think courtroom artists are new, but they aren't. There were courtroom artists in the that I found in the newspaper. The one on the left shows John and Lucy and the baby. Not much of the baby. The one on the right, though, actually shows most of the principals of the trial. The prosecutor who's standing with his glasses on. Over here is Melvin's father on the far right, and his mother, his stepmother, who was very cruel to Lucy and is pretty well captured in that little piece of art. And on the far left is John and Lucy sitting next to him, and then his lawyers in front of him. And of course, when the jury came back with the verdict, it was a pretty dramatic headline. That's about as big a type as you could put on the newspaper at that time. So that's, you know, that's around, that's just the basic story that I was finding about John and this murder. I think most of you may know the origins, the details and why it got so much publicity was the fact that not only the way John shot Melvin, but Melvin had, well, knocked up Lucy, for lack of a better term. She was 19. He got her pregnant. It was the second girl that Melvin Wolfe had gotten pregnant. I found that out. The Wolfe family, by the way, how many of you, if you're interested in history and little history nuggets you stumble on, Melvin Wolfe's father was Jacob Wolfe. Jacob Wolfe was the great nephew of General Wolfe, who was the British commanding officer who won the Battle of Quebec for the British and was killed in the battle. It is known, it is first, it's the reason why we're speaking English and not French. And second is it's also the site of the only monument in any place in the world that is made to both generals, both General Wolfe for the British and General Montcalm, who was the French general at that battle. It sits on the Plains of Abraham in Quebec City. I was able to track down the photo on the right is from a newspaper. That's why it's not in great quality, but that's the jury that convicted John and sentenced and came up with the sentence of life in prison. I found it fascinating to find that. And the left, I found hanging in the courthouse, in the office of the clerk, right outside the judge's chambers. And that's a picture taken from about, it didn't have a date, but that is about 1903, because on the far left, the guy with the number 1 on it is the sheriff, who was the sheriff who was a friend of John, who arrested him, and who was the sheriff during the term in which John spent his time in jail. So it had to be right at that. And also, well, there are the different lawyers that are involved, including number 2 up there as a fascinating character, because that's Levi Mock, who served as John's lawyer until 2 weeks before the trial, when he withdrew his representation and sued John because there was a dispute over the fees. And he actually sued him right before the trial started. Levi was, by varying accounts, someplace between 6'6", that's at the small end, to 6'11". Yeah. And this is in 1903, when the average man is probably 5'8", 5'7". And there were all sorts of, he was quite a character, very well known, very well respected lawyer. But he and his 2 sons, who practiced with him, who are in the top row, left John without them as their lawyers. They were the lead lawyers in the case, and withdrew, like I said, 2 weeks before the trial. But I found it fascinating to be able to put pictures and actually see the people that were involved in this. The book itself talks about events, but it's also about people. You know, it's really about the people who were caught up in this situation. And then afterwards, John started acting crazy in his jail cells, just for banging his head against the cell. This is after his conviction, but before he was actually sentenced. Banging his head, bloodying his hands, pounding on the cells, talking nonsense, not eating, not going to the bathroom, which is something you can't really fake, I don't think, at least not for 10 days without a bowel movement. And so the headline started about the post-trial, which makes this story different. It's not just about the murder. It's not just about the trial. It's also about what happened afterwards. How he was, the dispute arose as to whether he was sane or whether he was just faking it. A second jury, appointed by the trial judge, found with deliberation of about 5 minutes that he was clearly insane. The sheriff supported that. He was then, instead of being sent to prison, he was sent to the East Haven Mental Asylum. And the dispute continued in the newspapers as to whether he was sane or insane. And the newspapers were a great source of information on this. And finally, John was released from the insane asylum in 1909, not found cured, but he was found basically that the superintendent found that he couldn't do anything more for John. And we'll get to this in a little bit, but he wasn't released exactly because he was rearrested because he had been re-indicted for the crime because his conviction had been overturned by the Indiana Supreme Court. We'll talk about that in a minute. But here is ultimately he was released on a $15,000 bond. May not sound like a lot, but that's the equivalent of $500,000 today. Okay. Keep in mind, John was a very wealthy man. How do I know that? Well, he was a very wealthy man when the crime occurred, not later. I was able to go to public records. It's a great resource if you know how to look through them. The Indiana Archives, the Wells County Court Recorder, Auditor, Randolph County Court, Recorder and Auditor in Randolph County. I found all the case files. This list of cases are lawsuits that John was involved in. He was a wealthy businessman. He owned property. He leased it out. He loaned money, and he didn't have a moment's hesitation to sue people when they defaulted on the loan, defaulted on a mortgage. I was able to find all of these cases. And with most of them, I could find the case file and had a chance to actually see the paperwork of those cases. I found those in the clerk's office. Part of the story that's particularly important to understanding John is what happened to his two older daughters. When he became wealthy, a lot of people think, he had this great fortune. But in family matters, not so much. His first two daughters both married oil field workers. They both were abused by them. They were brothers, the Vandergrift brothers. The daughters were abused by them, physically abused by them, and ultimately both of them were abandoned by their husbands, one of them out of state in Pennsylvania. And both of them were pregnant when they were abandoned by their husbands. One of the children died, was stillborn. The other became John's first granddaughter. However, I was able to actually find their divorce files, one in Wells County, one in neighboring Grant County, or Huntington County, Huntington County. It actually took a while to track that down. By 1899, both daughters were divorced. Why the recorder? Well, it was the map. Most of you probably, well, maybe not. Wells County, Bluffton is the county seat, and that's where it's located in northeastern Indiana, just south of Fort Wayne. Over here on the right is probably about 1905 map from the recorder's office in Wells County. Bluffton is at the top. that's the county seat. Petroleum was an incredibly thriving town because of I mentioned John was wealthy, it was because of oil. Oil was discovered on his property in about 1892. By 1896, I do know from newspaper accounts that he had 6 oil wells producing on his property in 1896. And this town of Petroleum was mapped out and was thriving. It's amazing how thriving it was. It had 2 doctors. It had a grocery store, a general store. It had a little ice cream parlor with candy and stuff, whatever they call those. It had a barber shop. It had a big stable, which John owned, although he leased it out. It was a thriving place. You would never know that to go back through it today. But this Petroleum is about 9 miles south of Bluffton. About 1.25 miles, 1.5 miles south of there is where John Terrell lived. And at 2 miles east and a little bit south is where the Wolf family lived. So by going to the records, I could track down where they lived and got a sense of the relationship between them. And as you see, if you focus in on it, it's not really that far, but these are where the roads are. Gave me a much better idea about what happened on in the shooting and tracking it down where all of these things occurred. It was outside of John's house. That's where the roadside shooting took place. Yeah. And then up in Petroleum, and if you can see the little boxes up there, the little dark boxes, that's the town of Petroleum. That's where John chased the injured Melvin Wolf, chased him to the doctor's office, and that's where he shot the doctor. Or I didn't shoot the doctor, shot the Melvin Wolf in the doctor's office. That was in Petroleum. Now, I used those of the critique group, saw some of my early drafts when I went way back in some family history to start writing this. And I ended up not using that, but it was, for me, it was important. For me, it was useful to go way back. I found the land grants for my great-great-grandfather and his brothers, who were the first Terrells to come to Indiana. I found census forms. The ones up here are from 1860 and from 1880. The 1861 shows shows John living with his great uncle. And that was in, I said, 1860 in Randolph County. The one on the right shows from 1880, and it shows John is now being the head of household, his great uncle living with him and living in Wells County. He moved up to Wells County right about in early 1880, like January of 1880. I found Lucy's guardianship. Those were in court records when after John went crazy in the jail cell, she filed a guardianship. In that guardianship proceeding, yet another jury found that he had gone insane. This is probably the most fascinating discovery I had. That is the transcript of John's trial. It was in the archives, the Indiana State Archives. When I saw that there had been, early on, I looked up in just like I would any other case, I looked up John's case and found that there was an Indiana Supreme Court case. When I found that, I knew that there had to be a transcript someplace. And first I contacted the Supreme Court clerk, and they checked and they found that that transcript had been transferred over to the Indiana Archives. I then contacted Indiana Archives and they found the transcript. What amazed them is that most of the transcripts at that time are maybe half an inch, maybe an inch. And suddenly, this is by far the biggest transcript from that time period that they had ever seen. And when I opened it, I was probably the first person in 120 years who had opened that file. It is one volume. Modern records, well, modern ones are in electronic, but before that, you know, they had a rule which limited volumes to 250 pages. So that you would have several volumes in a case if it had an extensive record. But this was in one volume, and the paper was so very thin, almost like onion skin. And so they couldn't take it apart to copy it. So I had to spend 2 weeks at the Indiana State Archives with my phone making PDF images of every page of that. And as I said over here, you'll see 2 volumes of simply my notes in reviewing this. It showed the indictment, which was critical because you'll see the arrow pointing to a 18903. That typo, somebody probably started typing in 18 instead of 19 because it's 1903. How many of us are still occasionally writing 19, starting dates with 19, you know? Probably did that. Ultimately, that is why the court reversed John's conviction. A 3-week trial, a dozen experts, the jury, all of that. And why did they reverse it? They reversed it because there was a typographical error about the date of the shooting. And the court referred to that as an impossible date and reversed the decision. Now, having clerked at the Court of Appeals, having seen how judges work on occasion, up close and personal, I have my own opinion about that, which is there were huge legal issues. Very extensive record, as you just saw. And you know what? If they decided the case on that point, they didn't have to decide any of those other issues. They didn't have to read that transcript. Just saying. But the transcript also includes this, which is the jury verdict. I mentioned to you that John went arguably insane after the jury verdict. The reason he was transferred to the East Haven Asylum was because Governor Durbin intervened. Governor Durbin in himself is a fascinating character, but he intervened before the sheriff could take John to the state prison and told him no, take him to the East Haven Asylum. And what he did was he used a mechanism by paroling John to the East Haven Asylum until cured, at which time he will be remanded back to the state prison to serve the rest of his sentence. These are these came from the archives. I found these in the Indiana State Archives. On the left is the handwritten note that he wrote as soon as he found out that John had been sentenced, because he wanted that to get to the sheriff so he wouldn't take him to the state prison. And then on the right is the first page of the 2-page order that was typed up and sent to the sheriff the next day. So the first one, he hand wrote out something, handed it to a messenger, had it taken up all the way up to Boston to make sure John wasn't taken to the prison. And then the next day, the sheriff received the typed order. I'm sorry? Yeah. Then we talk about, I said he was sent to the mental asylum, but this is the Supreme Court decision. On the left is the first page of the Supreme Court decision that reversed John's conviction. On the right, some of the news coverage. Again, I found the cover, this copy I actually found in the archives, but I had already found the printed copy by just doing a normal research on a legal research source that I used. What's interesting about this is that meant John was a free man because his conviction had been reversed. But he wasn't, because he was in an insane asylum and he remained there. And before he was released, he was re-indicted. So the other sources I used, we talked about things, the Wells County Public Library, Bracken Library, they're great resources. That's how I found information about John's wealth, incredible wealth that he had from these oil wells, from his businesses. By the way, by the time he was finally put out on bond, he was effectively destitute. He didn't know, the family still had some property, but all of John's assets, his interest in all the banks, his interest in his money in the banks, his interest in the opera house, all of that was gone. This is from the state library. I couldn't find this anyplace else, but the state library helped me find this. This was an article, a full-page story that ran in the Indianapolis Sunday Sentinel about John and his life in prison. And it shows his daily schedule. He had his office moved into his jail cell, and how he met with businessmen and then his family and then bankers, and then he'd meet with the people concerning the construction of the opera house. This is to represent John leaning out his cell, yelling instructions to a workman who was stationed underneath John's cell to carry his instructions back to the workmen who were building the opera house. I also continued, and some of this was at the request of the publisher, and some, in the first draft, and some of it was just me. But researching other things there are so many issues that come into play, I think, with regard to writing this book and telling the story. Some of the sources I used to research the insanity defense, to research the status or the type of facilities, the mental institutions at that time. It's a classic book, 10 Days in a Madhouse, by reporter Nellie Bly. It's how she became famous. It was staging insanity so she could get inside of a mental asylum for women in New York City in the 1880s. Research on yellow journalism. You saw the headlines, the nature of those type of headlines and the type of coverage that was given this story. Research on atheism, because John was an atheist, despite the fact his father and his grandfather were both preachers. That he bears the name Wesley because his great-grandfather was George Wesley Terrell. His grandfather was George Wesley Terrell. His father was William Wesley Terrell, and he was John Wesley Terrell. And I think probably most of you know, what's the significance of Wesley? Wesleyism, which is the Methodist Church. And John Wesley, of course, was one of the great religious leaders in this, not in this country, in England, but developing and spreading the Methodist Church and several other related religions. And he bore that name, yet he was an atheist. And that came out at trial. That's a fascinating part of the trial. Witnesses were allowed to testify that his moral reputation was poor because he didn't believe in the Bible and he didn't believe in God, and he would argue with preachers. And I have this view, how many of you know anything about Wells County? It's still very rural. And I have a feeling that if you were allowed, if it came out at trial today that a defendant was an atheist sitting on the witness stand, the jury would convict him of something. It's that type of community. So anyway, one of the important parts, I think, in doing any of these stories, and it was important to me, and I think it's important to what carries over into the book, is visiting the locations and the sites where all of this happened. This is the courtroom where it took place. That's the actual courthouse and the courtroom where it took place. And we're on November 21st, mark this down, I'm actually doing a program in that courtroom with the judge of the Wells Circuit Court. And the program is going to emphasize the trial. And we're going to talk about the procedures and the rulings, the evidence. And I'm really looking forward to standing in the same courtroom where John was tried 120 years ago and doing a presentation. There's the locations like Petroleum. That's what that town where all this happened. That's what it looks like today. And to walk those streets, to go up there and stop and walk those streets, it just gives you a sense of the place. My wife, just as a side note, I didn't know this until I was doing some research. She went to 1st and 2nd grade in Petroleum Elementary. Just a happenstance, but that's what the Wolf's house, their house is no longer there. It's a newer house, but that's what the Wolf property looks like. And the house that's now on what was the Wolf farm. That's the church where Melvin Wolf's funeral was held, which is in this little crossroads called Domestic. And that's the way it looks today. It's still there. This is what the road looks like where John ambushed Melvin Wolf. Remember that newspaper photo I showed a little earlier? Well, that's that site. It's now Highway 1, State Highway 1. And that's where the ambush took place. And you can picture it because it's not changed that much. And in fact, that is John's house. It is the same house where he and his family were living when all of this took place. It's still there. I checked it out. I even hired a title insurance company to double check what I'd found out. And so that's the same house where John and his family lived and when all of this took place. And it does give you an interesting sense about it. It's a tragic story of 3 people, and it ends where all stories end. I visited all of the cemeteries of all of the principals. On the left is John's tombstone and his wife, where they're buried. Behind that is where his father, my great-grandfather, is buried. That's his tombstone behind that to the left. The Johnson, that's Lucy's cemetery. She remarried about 10 years after these incidents, 10, 12 years, and that's where she is buried. She died in 1959. So she lived for a while, quite a while. Unfortunately, Mabel, I don't have the photo up here on the slide, but I did visit her grave. Mabel, the baby that she had, she died of cancer before she reached age 40. And then on the right is Melvin, and that's where he is buried from his, he died obviously in 1903. So I'll try to rush through this. I know I'm taking too much time here, but writing the story and rewriting it. Well, the first decision was, how did I write this? Do I write it as historical fiction? We have somebody who wrote a historical fiction about her family. Do I write it as straight nonfiction? do I write a narrative nonfiction? And I played with this. The critique group was really helpful because I played with versions of this and they gave me comments and gave me things to think about. Ended up using it as, it is nonfiction, but there are elements of narrative nonfiction. For example, the buggy ride that opens the book is the buggy ride when Melvin and his stepsister were going by the Terrell family, and when the ambush occurred, there's conversations in there that they're drawn from what I know of the characters and the time and the people involved. But I did use some literary license in creating that discussion. But most of the discussions that are in the book and all of the trial testimony is all right out of the transcript. So I used differing first approach with differing points of view. That was in May 2021 when I started this. Went to a second approach, which is to start early when the Terrells first came to Indiana. I ditched that after about 50 or 60 pages. And then a third approach, which is where I start with the discovery of oil. John's life really changed. And that's where I end up starting the book. Although the first chapter is a preview of some things that happened later. The first draft was 130,000 words. My second draft was about maybe 110,000 words. That was in the fall of 2022. And then that's when I started looking for a publisher. I reviewed books in the library. I reviewed books in bookstores to see who was publishing true crime. I stumbled across and found out, thanks to Janice and having Gary Sinecki, right? Sosnicki. Come, and if you remember, he spoke on the potato masher murder. Well, he was published by Kent State University Press. And I looked into that, and they had a series of historical true crime. They run a series of them. And so they were among the 3 or 4 book proposals that I sent out. I drafted the book proposals. Janice was very helpful in doing that. And I submitted those proposals in the fall of 2022. I got a positive response from Kent State University Press in about February of 2023. I made revisions pursuant to their comments and submitted it to the University Press, who then submitted it to 3 independent reviewers to look it over and then read it and make comments back. They liked it. They were very positive about it. Negotiated the contract with Kent State University Press in about October of 2023. And I did negotiate. There were certain things I got more free copies. I got a higher royalty rate. I got a lower price on my author copies. I was able to negotiate those, and I negotiated to keep, not that I'm anticipating it, but just in case Leonardo DiCaprio gets a copy of this sometime, I negotiated to keep 100% of the movie rights. And signed the contract on November 27th. And then we have the final steps, which were adding endnotes, because my initial draft did not have endnotes, and the University Press requires endnotes. So keep that in mind if you're doing a true crime book or something that you think you might want to submit to a University Press. Work with footnotes and endnotes at the beginning, because it'd be a lot easier to do it at the beginning than to go back and read it and have to find the sources for all of those. The book ends up with about 475 endnotes. Then I did the final revisions, which were editing, compressing. The one thing they were asking for was compressing some of the trial testimony There were some spots where it was a little repetitive, so condense that. But also by creating the endnotes, I also transferred some of the research notes, some of the little sidebar type things, I transferred those all into endnotes. So I ended up with the final text is about 87,000 words. And I like to think that it really reads like a novel. And so it's about the length of an average novel, I think. And then the other thing about a nonfiction book is I had to create an index, and that's the author's responsibility. So I either had to do it or I had to hire somebody, and I guess the average is maybe $1,500 or something. So I decided to create my own, and our former member, Larry Swayze, who made a living at creating indexes, was very helpful, giving me some guidance, gave me a great suggestion on a book. And last year, when I was in Florida for the winter, after Christmas, I started working on the index, and I used that book and some of Larry's advice. And so I created an index which they liked, and it's the index that's in the book. Then comes reviewing the final proof, which was this summer. God knows, no matter how many times you go over it, you're going to miss something. I will tell you there's one typo, and it's not in the text, but there is one typo in the book. And it won't be in the ebook version. It won't be in ones that are printed after that, but the initial run, it's got one typo in it.
Well, it will probably overturn the book.
That's right. And it's only fitting that that book has a typo. I never thought of that, but it is only fitting that that book has one typo in it. And then this is the part we all look forward to. And for me, it was really special. While I've have 3 novels, which I am very proud of. I don't apologize for the quality of those because they are independently published or self-published, however you want to term it. But it was a nice feeling to get that box one day and open it up and find the book. And I have a few copies over there. So if you have any questions, I'd be glad to, presentations. I have done one podcast interview already that will be up on Most Notorious in the next week or so. I have another one on Monday I'm doing for true crime authors and extraordinary people. That's the name of the podcast. So, and I'm doing that one on Monday. It will be up hopefully within the next week or so after that. I have a program the day of the formal release of the book at Wells County Public Library, which is a kick because the current Wells County Public Library sits on the same site as the old Wells County Jail, where my great uncle spent so much time. Then on November 21, I mentioned this, I'm doing a program with Judge Kirchhoff at the Wells Circuit Court in the same courtroom that John stood trial 121 years ago. And then I have a couple of programs after I get back from Florida next spring that are lined up, a couple of public libraries. I'm doing the Anderson Public Library Artisan Fair. Janice and I are doing that November 16, the Lou Wallace Book Fair in Crawfordsville on November 30. And then I'm real pleased to be part of, it's sort of the icing on the cake, I think, to be part of the Indiana Historical Society Holiday Art Fair or Holiday Authors Fair on December 7th. So, any questions? Yes, sir.
2 things. First thing,
I noticed, listening to you speak about this, that, John was angry at Melvin for wronging his daughter.
Okay, there's a lot more to that. He, real quickly, if I have a couple minutes, is that okay? What happened with John, when there was a forced marriage and Lucy went to live with Melvin and his family. It's a chapter called The Wolf's Den. And she lived with the Wolf's family. And she was, first of all, he tried to get her to have an abortion, threw money at her, tried to have the doctor, went to see a doctor about it, and Lucy refused. Then he continued to abuse her. His stepmother particularly also abused her. He harassed her. Lucy found him in bed with his stepsister. Yeah. There's some issues about oral sex. There are terms that are used, which I didn't think were invented yet. And they're in that, I didn't make it up. They are in the court record. So is anybody really offended to hear if I didn't know the word cocksucker was a term that was commonly used back then. But that's what Melvin yells out as he goes by with Lucy and her father. Yeah, and then after he takes her home, throws her out of the buggy when she's 7 months pregnant, takes her back, throws her out, doesn't want her anymore. And the following year plus, he continues to harass not only Lucy and her father, but the entire Terrell family. He runs them off the road with a wagon. He shows them a gun as he goes by. He has a friend of his, a bully in town, pick a fight with John's son, who is the youngest in the family. He bumps into Lucy when he sees her at a store or something and then laughs at her. As he rides by the Terrell property the day of the shooting, he moves his carriage over, and John is out there with Mabel and his other granddaughter in the barnyard, and he's working, and Melvin yells out, "Hold up the bastard so I can see it."
Yeah, John was his breaking point.
That was the breaking point. The headline of the newspaper, when John did testify. It's fascinating to see his words, but the headline in the local newspaper about John's testimony said, "It got night," because John testified that that's when he basically blacked out. He didn't remember anything else until he was a couple of days later and he was in a jail cell. So, yeah, that's the short version of the abuse that Lucy and the Terrell family took that drove John to this point. Keeping in mind something I showed you earlier, which was, remember how his daughters, his two older daughters, were treated, how they were abused, how they were abandoned. Yeah, and so that's why the story to me, if it had just been, I found somebody in my family tree, matter of fact, there's one on the other side too that I'm thinking about. If I found somebody on my family tree who shot somebody and stood trial for murder, that's one thing. It would have been interesting, but it wouldn't have carried a book. But this is a story really about the people. And that's why I think it had such an impact on me, was because I think I learned about John. I learned about his daughters. I learned about the lawyers and what they were facing. And when I told this story, I want to tell it not from the standpoint of just what happened, but a story about the people it happened to.
I think you should probably consider, a documentary, on this, at some point. Because from your already.
Well, I'm still trying to figure out how to get to Leonardo DiCaprio, because I think he'd be great as John. Yes.
Like that thread sent to the attorneys for John, like today, something sensational, I get a lot of.
Not that I know of to the lawyers. They were, it was fascinating because during the time period, Governor Durbin was going out of office in 1904, the end of 1904. And he was swamped with petitions to pardon John. And also swamped equally. We're talking about petitions with thousands of names on them, were sent to the governor to pardon John for his offense. But also there were countering petitions, including one led by the foreman of the jury, whose name's on the jury verdict, to not pardon him. That's the question of, is he justified with what he did, or is he a man taking the law into his own hands? And that's a very fundamental question about, it's more than right and wrong. It's about, what are we as a society? Do we tolerate people who take law into their own hands, or do we not tolerate that? Do we have a land of laws, not men? We're going to find out November 5th. But there were, that's a fascinating part of this to me. There was, but the governor did refuse to pardon him, and the new governor who came in refused to pardon him.
Then mental illness aspect of that is certainly, echoing things we're dealing with today.
Yeah, the issue with mental illness is fascinating because it's much more complex. And as I said, there were a dozen expert witnesses. This is pre-Freud. Freud was in Europe and was beginning to be, people were paying attention to him. But this is when when you read what the experts were saying, and these were not podunk experts. Most of these dozen experts that were called in John's defense had studied in Europe. A number of them had studied in New York at Bellevue, which is, the nation's leading hospital for mental illness at the time. But they talk, when you read through, I read through all of their testimony, so you don't want to do that. But when you read through their testimony, you hear them using terms like melancholia, stuporious. It sounds like they're from Harry Potter, but it sounds like, from today's perspective, that it's a maybe half a degree removed from witchcraft, maybe half a degree removed from leeches. I mean, it's that type of, what we call today pseudoscience. And it had and we were on the cusp with Freud in Europe, but it wasn't here yet. And we were on the cusp of, for example, blood pressure. They didn't have portable blood pressure measuring devices. That came right about the time this trial happened. 1904-ish, 1905 was when they suddenly came up with the idea of measuring blood pressure with regard, because they talk about pressures in the head, and that these experts talked about that. But what the and you'll see in the epilogue, I talk about some of it because they asked me to, I did rewrite the epilogue. And I did that to, the publisher's request was for me to put more of my own thoughts in some of this. And so I used the epilogue mostly. There are spots throughout the book that you'll see my opinion, my personal views coming through, but particularly in the epilogue, you'll see some of my thoughts. And what happened is they had a jury. There were 12 farmers. Okay, all men, no women on the jury. There were 12 farmers. All of them except 2 were over 50, which meant they were all basically born before the Civil War. They were born at a time when their education probably, if at best, was going to school for a couple of months a year for a couple of 3 years until they could work in the fields to learn how to read and write. They didn't understand any of this science, which was pseudoscience, and they had 12 witnesses. To give you an idea, and I know I'm dragging on, you can do this if you want me to stop. They had, at that time, expert witnesses could testify. They were rare, but they could testify, but they had to testify as to their opinion by use of a hypothetical question. And the hypothetical question had to set out all of the facts that they were relying upon. It's a different procedure now, thank God, because what they had for each of those 12 witnesses, the prosecution or the defense asked the same hypothetical question, which was 16 single space pages. It took roughly 40 minutes to read that question, to which the answer was, what was he of sound or unsound mind, was how it ended. And all the defense witnesses would say he was of unsound mind. 12 witnesses, 40 minutes a question. Add that up. 8 hours, the jury was sitting in the box, listening to that same question being read over and over and over and over again, because it had to be asked the same way to each of those dozen witnesses. And do you think, what persuasive effect do you think that had on a jury of 12 farmers who grew up in the 1800s? Yeah. Yeah, they actually had, by the end of the trial, they actually were timing. They were actually timing, and one of the guys got it down to under 20 minutes. Yes.
So what time of year was that trial?
The trial took place in December. The murder was on July 12th.
Okay, we gotta wrap
Yep.
it up. We need to
Okay,
get going.
thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Are we going someplace?
Yeah, we're still, Jennifer on me. I have a reservation for 1:30, that's what, like,
Sorry.
no, it's.
See,
Yeah.
in the picture of the jury, there were actually 14. There were 2 males sitting in front.
There you go.
Yeah. So very sharp. Yeah, so I was wondering, even before you got this part, I thought Julie were about to 12. So, okay.